I knew something was wrong before I even put the truck in park, because there was dust floating above my front pasture. And dust does not just float like that unless somebody is moving fast where they have no business moving at all. Then I saw the road, a fresh white gravel road cut clean across my land like somebody had taken a box cutter to the place I had spent half my life paying for. And the first thing that went through my head was not anger, not even shock. It was this cold little thought that said, "Well, Caleb, somebody just decided you were the kind of man they could step over. My name is Caleb Mercer." And at the time this happened, I had been living off Old Mill Road for almost 16 years, about 7 miles outside a little town in western Kentucky called Belford, the kind of town where everybody knows which gas station has the better biscuits. Nobody locks their sheds unless they have city relatives visiting, and a man can still get judged pretty hard for letting his fence sag too long. I owned 18 acres out there. Nothing fancy, just pasture, a few old pecan trees, a shallow creek that went dry every August, and a white farmhouse my wife used to say leaned into bad weather like it had survived worse. She passed 3 years before all this, and after that, the place got quiet in a way I still do not know how to explain. I kept mowing, kept repairing the south fence, kept paying taxes, kept walking the tree line in the evenings with my old dog Rusty, mostly because routine gives grief somewhere to sit. So when I tell you that land was not just dirt to me, I mean it. It had my sweat in it, my wife's flower beds around the porch, my father's old tractor rusting behind the barn because I never had the heart to sell it, and more memories than any county record could ever list. Now behind my place, past the back ridge, there was a big undeveloped chunk of land, maybe 60 acres, mostly cedar, scrub oak, and rolling clay hills that turned slick as soap after rain. For years, nobody cared about it except deer hunters and teenagers looking for some way to get stuck in mud. Then Belford started changing. People from Lexington and Nashville discovered that old farmland looked real charming once you put the word estates behind it, and suddenly every field with a decent sunset became an investment opportunity. That was when the Whitlock Group bought the back parcel. The man in charge was Everett Shaw, and I had seen him twice before I ever spoke to him. Once standing near a survey truck wearing a vest so clean it looked like it had never been accused of work, and once stepping out of a black Range Rover at the county office, smiling at everybody like he had already memorized which hands needed shaking. Everett was one of those polished men who looked expensive from a distance, hair combed back, watch shining, boots too pretty for gravel. Voice probably sounded like a loan approval even when he ordered lunch. The kind of man who says community when he means profit, and opportunity when he means your problem is about to become his shortcut. I did not have anything against him at first. People buy land, towns grow, that is life. I'm not one of those fellows who thinks time should freeze just because he likes the view. But there is a way to do things, especially out in the country. You introduce yourself. You ask questions. You respect property lines, because property lines are not suggestions. They are the closest thing rural folks have to a peace treaty. Everett Shaw never introduced himself. That should have told me plenty. That evening, I had just come back from the feed store with 2 bags of cracked corn in the bed of the truck. I turned off the county road, past my mailbox, and my tires crunched over little bits of limestone that had spilled out near my driveway. That was the first clue. The second clue was the dust. The third was the sound. Diesel engines somewhere they were not supposed to be. I eased forward, and there it was. A brand new access road running from the road shoulder, across the front section of my pasture, then angling toward the ridge behind my barn. Not a dirt track, not a mistake, not a couple of tire marks from somebody lost. This was a proper construction road, graded, packed, edged with a drainage cut. Fresh stakes in the ground with orange ribbon fluttering like little flags of disrespect. At the far end, 2 flatbed trucks were hauling lumber toward Everett's property, and a crew in hard hats was standing around like they had been doing it all week. I sat there for a second with my hands still on the wheel, and I swear the world got so quiet I could hear Rusty whining in the passenger seat. You ever have that moment where your brain tries to be polite before your common sense catches up? I actually thought, maybe there is some explanation. Maybe the county approved something I missed. Maybe there is a temporary utility issue. Maybe some surveyor made a mistake. That lasted about 10 seconds. Then a dump truck came bouncing across my pasture, right over the road they had built on my land. The driver gave me a little 2-finger wave like we were neighbors passing on Sunday morning, and whatever polite thought I had left had just walked out the door. I got out of the truck and followed the road on foot. Every step made me madder, but not the loud kind of mad. Not yet. It was the quiet kind. The kind that feels like your body is saving up heat. The gravel had been laid thick, crushed limestone, not cheap stuff. The ground underneath had been cut and leveled. There were tire tracks from heavy machinery, mud pushed into my grass, a shallow ditch carved along one side so rainwater would not wash it out. Somebody had planned this. Somebody had looked at a map with my name on it, or worse, looked at a map and decided my name did not matter enough to slow them down. I walked all the way to the edge of the ridge where the road disappeared toward the development site, and I could see a temporary sign through the trees. Coming soon, Hawthorne Ridge, luxury homes, starting in the low 700s. I laughed when I read that, not because it was funny, but because sometimes your body does not know what else to do with disrespect. That big, luxury homes, starting in the low 700s. And apparently, the budget did not include asking the man whose land they had just sliced open. I called the number on the sign right there, standing in my own field with the gravel under my boots and dust sticking to my shirt. A woman answered first, pleasant office voice, then transferred me to Everett like this was a billing question. He picked up on the second ring. Caleb Mercer, right? He said, as if we'd been expecting each other. That bothered me immediately. He knew my name, which meant this was not confusion. I said, you have trucks crossing my property. He chuckled. Not a big laugh, just a little soft one. The kind men use when they want to make you feel smaller without sounding rude. Oh, that temporary construction access, he said. We were told there may be an old farm easement across that front section. Should only be for the early phase. Should not inconvenience you much. I looked down at the fresh gravel under my boots and said, Everett, you built a road through land you do not own. There was a pause then, half a breath, just long enough for the salesman voice to slide into place. Mr. Mercer, I understand your concern. Truly I do. But this project is going to bring value to the whole area. Roads, utilities, increased property values, local jobs. We are not trying to create conflict here. I said, then you should have started by not trespassing. His tone changed just a little. Still calm, but the smile had left it. Let us not turn this into something difficult. Now that right there, that sentence, that was the first honest thing Everett Shaw said to me. Not because he meant peace. He meant surrender. He meant, I have money moving, crews scheduled, investors waiting, and I need you to understand that your rights are now an inconvenience to my timeline. I told him he had until morning to stop using my land and have someone contact me in writing. He sighed like I was a child refusing to share a toy. Caleb, he said, and I hated that he used my first name. We both know there are practical realities here. I said, practical does not mean legal. Then I hung up before I said something that would make my mother rise from the grave and slap the back of my head. That night, I barely slept. I kept seeing headlights crossing my field, kept hearing gravel under tires, kept thinking about how easy it had been for them. One decision in some conference room, one shrug from some engineer, one rich man assuming a widower in an old farmhouse would complain for a few days and then wear himself out. And I will be honest with you, for a little while, I felt exactly how they wanted me to feel. Small, outnumbered, like I was standing in front of a machine already moving too fast to stop. But sometime before dawn, I got up, made coffee, walked onto the porch, and watched another convoy of trucks roll through my pasture under the grey morning sky. They did not slow down. They did not look ashamed. They looked comfortable. And that was the moment something in me settled. Not exploded, settled. I took one sip of coffee, looked at Rusty sitting beside me, and said, well, boy, I guess we are about to become inconvenient. By 7 that morning, I had already taken more pictures than a proud grandparent at a kindergarten play. Every tire track, every load of gravel, every stake with orange ribbon, every truck that came through with a company logo on the door. And I made sure the timestamp was on every single one because anger feels good in the moment. But evidence is what walks into a courtroom with its boots clean. Around 9, I called a surveyor I had used years before, a fellow named Hank Blevins, who had been surveying land in 3 counties since before half the county commissioners learned how to tie a tie. Hank did not talk much, which I liked. I told him what happened, and he said, they crossed your front pasture. I said, sure did. He was quiet for a second, then said, well, that is bold. Coming from Hank, that was basically profanity. He came out that afternoon with his tripod, his flags, and his old sunburned neck, and within 20 minutes he had the corners marked so clearly even Everett Shaw's shiny boots could have found them. Hank stood there at the edge of that gravel road, looked at the property pins, looked at the new construction track, then looked at me and said, "Caleb, unless the good Lord filed an easement overnight, this is all yours." I asked him to put that in writing. He said, "Already planned on it." The next person I called was Miriam Cole, an attorney over in Mayfield who had handled a boundary dispute for my cousin years back and scared the opposing lawyer so bad the man forgot where he parked. Miriam was not loud, not dramatic, not one of those attorneys who pounds tables like she is auditioning for daytime television. She was worse than that. She was calm. Calm in a way that made you feel like she had already read the ending and was just waiting for everybody else to catch up. I brought her the deed, the title policy, Hank's preliminary notes, my photos, and a little notebook where I had written down every truck I saw that morning. She flipped through all of it at her desk, wearing reading glasses low on her nose, and after about 10 minutes she leaned back and said, "Did they ever ask you for access?" I said, "No, ma'am." "Did they offer payment?" "No, ma'am." "Did they provide any recorded easement, construction license, county authorization, utility order, anything?" I said, "No, ma'am." And every time I said it, her eyebrows climbed a little higher. Finally, she closed the folder and said, "Dan, Mr. Shaw has confused confidence with consent." I liked her immediately. She sent a formal cease and desist that same day, and not some polite little "please stop bothering my client" letter either. It said the Whitlock Group had entered private property without authorization, altered the land, created a roadway, and was continuing trespass through repeated use, and it demanded immediate cessation, removal of the roadway, restoration of the pasture, and preservation of all communications related to their decision to use my land. That last part mattered. Miriam told me people like Everett do not just make mistakes, they leave fingerprints in emails. I expected, foolishly maybe, that once a law office got involved, the trucks would at least slow down. They did not. If anything, they moved faster. The next morning, before the sun had burned the dew off the grass, I heard engines again. I walked up with my coffee and saw a concrete mixer easing through like it was headed to a church picnic. Behind it came 2 pickups, a lumber truck, and a skid steer chained to a trailer. One of the workers had even set up a portable light tower near the curve of the road, which told me they were planning to run early and late if they had to. That was when I understood Everett's game. He was not trying to win an argument. He was trying to outrun one. Construction is momentum. Every day has a schedule, every delay has a cost, and every contractor waiting around becomes another man with an invoice. Everett thought if he pushed hard enough, fast enough, he could make stopping him feel more expensive than letting him finish. It was not just arrogance, it was strategy. He was betting that I would get tired, that I would worry about legal bills, that some neighbor would tell me to be reasonable, that the county would shrug, that the court would hesitate because houses were already going up. And to be fair, for about half a day, that strategy worked on my nerves. I could feel it working. I would look at those trucks and think, "Lord, this is bigger than me." Then I would look at the deed with my name on it and think, "No, it is not." That evening, Everett called me himself. I almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity is a dangerous thing, and I wanted to hear what a man sounded like when he knew he was wrong but was still trying to sell it. "Caleb," he said, smooth as warm butter. "I understand you have retained counsel." I said, "I understand you can read." He gave a dry little laugh, but there was no humor in it. "We want to resolve this amicably." I said, "Good. Stop using my land. That is the resolution." He exhaled through his nose, and I could picture him pinching the bridge of it like I was costing him patience he had generously budgeted. "The access is temporary. Temporary things still require permission. Everett, we are prepared to discuss compensation. You were prepared to discuss it after you got caught. That is not the same thing." His voice tightened. "You need to think carefully about whether you want to be the person standing in the way of a project that benefits this community." There it was, the costume change, from friendly neighbor to public servant. I looked out my kitchen window at the gravel scar across my field and said, "You did not care about the community when you decided my property line was optional." He went quiet, and then he said the sentence that told me exactly who I was dealing with. People around here are going to remember who made this difficult. I said, good. Make sure they spell my name right. Then I hung up. Now, I'm not going to pretend I was brave every second of this. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of papers, a half-cold cup of coffee, and Rusty snoring under the chair, and I felt my wife's absence so hard it hurt. Linda would have known exactly what to say. She was 5'3", taught 4th grade for 30 years, and could make a grown man apologize by looking at him over the top of her glasses. I could almost hear her saying, "Caleb, do not let somebody else act ugly and then convince you manners require silence." So I wrote that down in my notebook. Not for court, just for me. The next morning, Miriam files for emergency injunctive relief. Those words sound expensive because they are, but they also sound like a hammer when you are holding the right end of it. The hearing happened 5 days later. Everett came in wearing a navy suit, white shirt, no tie, like he wanted the judge to know he was serious but still approachable. His attorney, a sharp young man with a haircut that probably had its own maintenance schedule, argued that the rear parcel had limited practical access, that the route across my pasture was the safest and most economically reasonable temporary construction path, that the development would bring tax revenue and local improvements, and that any harm to me could be compensated later. I remember staring at the back of his head, thinking, that phrase could cover half the sins in America if you let it. Miriam stood up with one folder and no theatrics. She showed the judge my deed. She showed Hank's survey. She showed the title search with no recorded easement. She showed the photos of trucks continuing to cross after written notice. Then she said, "Your Honor, my client was not approached because they did not want consent. They wanted momentum. They entered first, altered first, profited first. And now they ask this court to treat their convenience as though it creates a right." The courtroom got very still. Everett kept his face arranged, but I saw his jaw move once, like he had bitten down on something unpleasant. The judge, an older man named Judge Harlan Voss, looked over the exhibits for what felt like a full winter. Then he looked at Everett's attorney and asked, "Where is the recorded easement?" The attorney said, "We do not have one at this time, Your Honor." The judge asked, "Where is the written access agreement?" "We do not have one." "Where is the county order authorizing entry across Mr. San?" "Mercer's land." "There is no such order." Judge Voss leaned back, folded his hands and said, "Then what you have is a business preference, not a property right." I could have kissed that man on the forehead. I did not, because that is frowned upon in court. But spiritually, I was already halfway there. The order came down that afternoon. Whitlock Group was prohibited from entering or using my property. They had 14 days to remove the roadway and restore the land, and any continued use could trigger sanctions. When Miriam and I walked out, Everett was standing near the courthouse steps talking low with his attorney. He looked at me, and for the first time since I had known his name, he did not smile. I thought maybe that would be the end of it. That is adorable. Looking back, 14 days passed, and the gravel road remained right where it was, shining white in the sun like a dare. The trucks stopped crossing for a few days. Then I started seeing pickups nosing up near the entrance, workers walking the line, delivery drivers calling somebody from the shoulder. Everett was testing the fence before the fence even existed. So I called a man named Dale Pritchard, who built gates, barns, and occasionally, according to town rumor, fear. Dale showed up in a flatbed with steel posts, a welder, and a thermos big enough to hydrate a horse. He looked at the gravel road, looked at me, and said, "How permanent you want your no to be." I said, "Dale, I want them to feel it in their scheduling department." He nodded like that was a standard measurement. 2 days later, we set steel posts deep in concrete just inside my line, hung a heavy cattle gaze across the access point, reinforced it with a crossbar, and put on a lock that looked like it belonged on a federal evidence room. Then, because Dale was an artist in his own unpleasant way, we cut a shallow drainage trench along the inside shoulder where a truck might try to swing around. Nothing illegal, nothing reckless, no damage to anybody else's property. Just my land quietly remembering it had an owner. That evening, I stood there while Dale packed up his tools, and I swung that gate closed for the first time. It made a deep metal sound. Not loud exactly, but final. Dale spit into the dust and said, "That ought to improve communication." The next morning, at 6:12, the first truck arrived. The next morning, at 6:12, the first truck arrived. A long, dumb truck with dried mud up the tires, and a driver who looked half asleep until he saw that gate sitting across the road like a bad decision made out of steel. He stopped so hard the truck rocked forward. Then he leaned out the window and just stared, like maybe the gate would get embarrassed and move. 2 minutes later, another truck pulled up behind him. Then a pickup. Then a flatbed hauling lumber. And by 6:30 there was a line of construction traffic stretched down Old Mill Road long enough to make the school bus driver slow down and enjoy herself. I was on the porch with coffee in my hand, rusty at my feet, watching grown men discover property law in real time. One of the workers got out, walked up to the fence, and yelled, "Hey! We have to get through here." I said, "Then you have a problem with whoever told you that you could." He said, "Man, we are on a schedule." I said, "So is my coffee." He did not find that as funny as I did. Radio started crackling. Phones came out. Men pointed at the trench. One guy tried walking the shoulder like he was measuring whether a truck could squeeze past. Then Dale's little drainage cut smiled at him from the grass, and he walked right back. At 7004, my phone rang. Everett Shaw. I let it ring twice because I wanted him to spend a few seconds with his thoughts. When I answered, he did not say, "Good morning." He did not say, "Caleb." He said, "What the hell do you think you are doing?" And I have to tell you, after weeks of him sounding like a bank commercial with teeth, hearing the anger finally crack through was almost refreshing. I said, "I'm drinking coffee on my porch. You are blocking access to an active development." He snapped. I said, "No, Everett, I'm blocking access to my pasture. The development is your problem, same as the road was your choice." He started talking fast then. Lost revenue, subcontractor penalties, material delays, investor concerns, contractual exposure, every expensive phrase in the rich man's panic dictionary. And the more he talked, the calmer I got. That surprised me. I had expected to be shaking, maybe yelling. But there is a strange peace that comes when the thing you feared finally happens and you realize it is mostly just noise. He said, "You are going to pay for this." I looked out at the trucks idling in front of my locked gate and said, "Everett, I already paid for this land. That is the part you keep forgetting." Then I hung up and called Miriam. She listened without interrupting, then said, "Do not argue with him anymore. Take pictures, keep notes. Let his lawyer talk to me." That woman could have made a grocery list sound like a court order. By noon, the county inspector had been called, and by late afternoon, the Whitlock group had a much bigger headache than me. See, this Hawthorne Ridge did have other possible access, but none that had been permitted for active construction yet. Everett had chosen my pasture because it was cheaper, flatter, and faster. And because, I later learned through discovery, his investors were already breathing down his neck. He had promised them grading would start by spring, foundations by early summer, model homes by fall, and every delay made the numbers uglier. There was also an ugly little social piece to it that I had not understood at first. Everett did not just think I was convenient. He thought I was irrelevant. An older widower in a leaning farmhouse. No kids at home. No big money. No political pull. Probably lonely enough to fold if enough important people frowned at him. That is what made the whole thing personal. Not because we had some long feud, but because he had looked at my life from a distance and decided it was light enough to push around. 3 weeks later, Everett was back in court asking for emergency temporary access across my property, and this time his face looked different, still polished, still expensive, but tighter around the eyes. Like sleep had become one more line item he could not afford. His attorney argued that without temporary access, the project would suffer major financial damage. Miriam stood up and said, "Your Honor, that damage is self-inflicted. My client did not create their schedule, did not approve their site plan, did not invite their contractors, and did not authorize their trespass. They gambled on using his land without permission, and now they want the court to ensure the bet." Judge Voss barely let Everett's attorney finish before denying the request. He said a court does not create a property right just because a business dislikes the cost of obeying the law. I wrote that sentence down in my notebook later. It felt like something my wife would have underlined twice. After that, things unraveled fast for Everett. He had to negotiate with a woman named Ruth Ann Wilkes, who owned a narrow strip east of the ridge where an old logging lane connected to a county road. Ruth Ann was 72, raised cattle most of her life, wore men's work gloves and pearl earrings to the feed store. and had disliked Everett since the day he called her acreage underutilized. When he came asking for access, Ruth Ann did not yell, did not lecture, did not pretend she was offended. She simply understood leverage the way old country people understand weather. She sold him the strip for $118,000, cash at closing. Plus, he had to pay for fencing, culvert improvements, drainage redesign, and a new entrance plan that pushed the whole development back months. Then came the permit revisions, the engineer fees, the environmental review, the delivery cancellations, the subcontractor rescheduling, and all the quiet, expensive bleeding that happens when a man tries to save money by stealing time from somebody else. I never got an exact number, but Miriam said based on filings and liens, the mess likely cost him well over $200,000 before the first house frame went up. And the best part, if I am allowed to be petty for one honest second, was watching them remove the road. Everett's company had to bring in machines and scrape every ton of limestone out of my pasture. I stood by the fence with Rusty, arms crossed, while the same kind of equipment that had invaded my land now crawled backward across it, undoing its own arrogance one bucket at a time. The driver would scoop gravel, dump it into a truck, smooth the dirt, then move another few feet, and little by little that white scar disappeared. By late summer, Hank came back out, confirmed the restoration, and Dale helped me reseed the pasture. When the first green came up, thin and soft through the dirt, I stood there longer than I meant to. It was not just grass. It was proof that something damaged does not have to stay marked forever. If you catch it in time and refuse to let the damage become normal. Everett never apologized. Not once. No letter, no phone call, no handshake at the diner. The closest thing I got was seeing him at a county meeting months later, standing near the coffee urn, looking right through me like I was weather. That told me all I needed to know. Some people regret what they did. Others only regret that it stopped working. Hawthorne Ridge did get built eventually. From Ruth Ann's side, with its stone entrance sign, fake lake, black iron fencing, and little flags on the mailboxes like they had invented neighborliness. Families live there now. Kids ride bikes on streets that almost became a permanent excuse to cross my land. Sometimes when I drive past, I wonder how many people behind those neat brick fronts know that their pretty subdivision nearly began with a theft nobody wanted to call theft because the man doing it wore a suit. People in town still ask me sometimes whether I would have done it differently if Everett had offered fair money from the start. I have thought about that more than I admit. Maybe I would have listened. Maybe I would have said no anyway. Maybe if he had knocked on my door like a man, instead of rolling trucks through my field like a conqueror, the whole thing could have ended with signatures, a check, and no hard feelings. But that is the point, is it not? Respect before pressure changes everything. Once somebody tries to bully you, the argument is no longer just about the thing they wanted. It becomes about whether they get to decide what your boundaries are worth, and that is where I drew the line. So if there is one thing I learned from that gravel road, it is this: do not let anyone dress up disrespect as progress, and do not let powerful people convince you that your rights are unreasonable just because they interfere with their plans. Maybe you think, I should have taken the money. Maybe you think I should have locked the gates sooner. Maybe you think development matters, and one stubborn landowner should not be able to slow down a whole project. I want to hear it. If you were in my boots, standing on your porch at sunrise, watching trucks line up at a gate you had every right to close, what would you have done? Would you negotiate? Would you fight? Or would you let it go for the sake of keeping peace in town? Drop your answer in the comments, because sooner or later, every community has to decide what matters more: convenience for the powerful or boundaries for everybody else.